In the year 900 before Christ, on the resplendent shores of the Mediterranean Sea, one of the most admired and mysterious civilizations of the ancient world flourished: Phoenicia. A land of bold traders and legendary navigators, the Phoenicians mastered the art of the sea, extending their influence from their city-states to the far reaches of the known world. Among them all, two shone with special power: Tyre and Sidon, proud urban jewels of Phoenicia, imposing on the seafront, full of bustling ports, markets saturated with spices, gold, and incense, and temples that exhaled the dark aroma of paganism. In those cities, opulence and idolatry were not opposites, but allies. Trade financed worship, and worship legitimized power. Baal, the storm god, and Astarte, the goddess of fertility, reigned in the spiritual heart of the people. And between the marble columns and the cobbled streets, where the famous purple fabrics that would clothe emperors were woven, the soul of Phoenicia was tinged with shadows. It was in Sidon, the most prominent in the north, where a figure emerged who would forever change the course of the kingdom. Ethbal, whose name in the Phoenician language, Ethbal, with Baal or Baal is with me, was already a harbinger of his destiny. He wasn't born a king, he became a king. A former priest of the Astarte cult, Ethbal harbored boundless ambition. Not satisfied with the altar, he longed for the throne, and he took it by force. With cunning and violence, he assassinated King Phelis and proclaimed himself ruler of the Sidonians. It was a precise, bloody, and decisive blow. Thus, Ethbal fused political and spiritual power, priest and monarch, leader of men and guide of dark cults. Under his rule, Sidon became a center of idolatry like never before. Temples grew in number and splendor. Statues of Astarte, with her sensual, deathly visage, appeared on every corner. The cult degenerated into forbidden rituals, sacred orgies, human sacrifices, and blood pacts. Ethbal was not a mere participant. He was the architect of the entire religious system, the high priest of institutionalized sin. But Ethbal wasn't content with what he had already achieved. He had a dream, and it wasn't small. It wasn't enough for him to rule Sidon with wealth and power. It wasn't enough for him to be king of the Sidonians or high priest of Astarte. He wanted more. He dreamed of extending his influence beyond the shores of Phoenicia, of aligning the neighboring powers under a single vision, spiritual, political, and profoundly pagan. He wished to build a religious empire where Baal would be worshipped from Tyre to Samaria, from the islands of the sea to the valleys of Canaan. And it was in the midst of this dream of greatness that his firstborn daughter was born. In the golden halls of the palace at Sidon, between fine linen curtains and columns carved with sacred symbols, Ethbal silently watched the newborn girl. He took her firmly, brought her close to his chest, and with a solemn, almost ritual voice, pronounced her name, Jezebel. A name of Phoenician origin, steeped in mystery and meaning. Some associate it with the exaltation of Baal, others translate it as a ritual question. Where is the prince? An ancient invocation uttered in temples, a cry seeking the manifestation of an absent god, or the arrival of a new one. But for Ethbal, it wasn't just a name, it was a destiny. He not only recognized her as his heir, but also consecrated her as an instrument of spiritual conquest. She wasn't just his daughter, she was his legacy. From birth, Jezebel was not raised as an ordinary child. She did not experience the innocent playfulness of other daughters of the nobility, nor was she surrounded by lullabies that spoke of tenderness or compassion. From her earliest days, she was immersed in the dense aroma of Phoenician incense, in the hypnotic chants of the priests of Astarte and Melkart, and in the living shadows of the temples where the consecrated virgins danced and oracles were pronounced in low voices between columns stained by the smoke and blood of sacrifices. Ethbal, her father, didn't see her as a child. He saw her as a divine project. Before becoming king, he himself had been high priest of Astarte, and he understood the hidden workings of religious power. He knew that nations could be subdued more easily by faith than by the sword. Therefore, Jezebel was his most carefully carved jewel. From a very young age, he exposed her to the most complex rituals, to the protocol of worship, to speeches before crowds. His education was not merely courtly, it was both sacred and political. He was taught the languages of merchants, the secrets of persuasion, the history of neighboring dynasties, sacred astrology, and the art of unarmed warfare. During her childhood, while other girls were learning embroidery or childhood songs, Jezebel observed sacrifices, listened to treaties, attended audiences and banquets where ambassadors from Egypt, Hatti, and Tyre discussed routes, ports, and alliances. His room was decorated with maps of the Mediterranean and effigies of ancient gods, and his nurse was a retired priestess who whispered dark tales to him about pacts between deities and kings. Jezebel didn't grow up to obey, but to dominate. In her adolescence, her beauty began to inspire fear rather than admiration. She had a gaze that never wavered. Her eyes were like glowing embers contained behind a veil of elegance. His voice, trained in the psalms of the temples, could both seduce and command. He did not raise his voice to impose authority. All he had to do was speak, and his father's advisors fell silent. His passage through the palace corridors became a ceremony. He knew when to show himself and when to disappear, when to smile and when to keep his face like marble. It was during those years that he began to weave his web of influence in the heart of the Sidonian palace. He didn't do so by storming the halls of power. He did so by waiting, observing, slowly penetrating the circles where the fate of the kingdom was decided. He gained the trust of senior priests by brilliantly interpreting omens and accurately reciting sacred texts. He captivated merchants and emissaries with his knowledge of the language of the sea and the value of spices, wine, and gold. She won over the people not with alms, but with her presence, appearing in processions as a living incarnation of the goddess Astarte, dressed in purple linen, crowned with flowers, and covered in perfumes imported from Arabia. Ethbal watched all this with a mixture of pride and calculation. He had built a temple with stones and the hands of men. But with Jezebel, he was building a living temple, an altar with a human face from which to manipulate the destinies of entire peoples. As a princess, Jezebel didn't need a throne to rule. Her power came not from a crown, but from her influence. While Ethbal ruled the kingdom from the throne, Jezebel shaped it from the spirit, from the temples, from the symbols. Her name was pronounced with respect in the streets, with fear on the altars, and with admiration in foreign courts. The virgins of the temple proclaimed her daughter of Astarte. The priests considered her an intermediary between the divine and the human, and the emissaries knew that no alliance with Sidon would prosper without first passing through the silent judgment of her gaze. And yet, Jezebel wasn't just looking at Sidon. From the palace balconies, her gaze was directed southward, toward a divided land with a new king in Samaria, an unstable kingdom, and an even greater throne to conquer. Because her ambition wasn't limited to the heart of Sidon, she was destined for something more, to be a key player in the destiny of the Mediterranean, to spread her cult, her lineage, and her fire. Now, it happened on a mild day, when the Mediterranean winds carried with them the scent of incense and salt. The sky was clear, but an omen hung over the waters. An unusual procession descended from the north. The royal caravan of Israel, headed by the young King Ahab, son of Omri, was advancing towards Sidon with a purpose that was not limited to trade. He was seeking treaties, yes, but also legitimacy, expansion, and an open door to the world across the sea. His father had built the first diplomatic bridges with Phoenicia. Now it was his turn to cross them. From the moment the Israelite chariots crossed the gates of Sidon, the welcome was majestic. The city, rich and ancient, shone like a jewel between the sea and the cedars of Lebanon. Priests walked at the front, sprinkling sacred perfumes. Musicians played drums and cymbals, and dancers wove figures with their bodies to the beat of a solemn welcome. The crowd had gathered in the streets, not only out of respect for the foreign guest, but because they knew that this day would not be just another in the history of Sidon. Omri's son came hungry for the sea, and Ethbal was waiting for him with a table set and a play already calculated. But it was upon entering the royal palace that Ahab realized he was not simply in a diplomatic court. Inside, the walls were not adorned with battle scenes or portraits of kings. What dominated the place were the gods. Statues of Baal flanked the columns like silent sentinels, their faces carved in stone and their eyes fixed, seemingly watching every step. At the corners, perpetual lamps burned in front of consecrated altars. Solar symbols, moons engraved in copper, arms extended for sacrifices. The palace wasn't just a royal residence, it was a sanctuary. There, political power and religion intertwined like the roots of a single tree. Ethbal, dressed in a white tunic and a gold-embroidered mantle, descended from his platform with the dignity of a king and the authority of a priest. There was no excess in their greeting, but rather a clear recognition among equals. For 3 days, the negotiations proceeded at a meticulous pace. Maps, trade records, caravan routes and ports were spread out on stone tables. Ethbal offered preferential access to Phoenician ports, maritime protection, cedar wood, wine, metals, and artisans. Israel, in turn, would provide what Sidon needed most: grain, oil, livestock, fresh water. Both kingdoms had what the other lacked. A pact seemed inevitable. However, while the treaties advanced in the shadows of the columns and among the voices of the scribes, Ethbal waited for the opportune moment to reveal his true condition. He didn't just want a trade agreement, he wanted an irreversible union. And on the 4th day, during a banquet in one of the palace's inner gardens, when the cups were full and the incense formed a sacred cloud over the gathering, the Phoenician king spoke. "King Ahab," he said calmly, "the numbers are on the table, the routes are marked, the caravans are ready. But treaties signed in ink can be undone. If we want a pact that will stand the test of time, one that doesn't depend on kings or signatures, it must be sealed with blood, with true union. I offer you my daughter, Jezebel, Princess of Sidon, as your wife. With her, this agreement will be eternal." Ahab didn't respond immediately. Jezebel's name was familiar to him. He knew she was no ordinary maiden. She was known in the neighboring courts as a powerful voice, well-versed in theology, commerce, and politics. Taking her as his wife wouldn't simply mean accepting a woman. It would mean accepting an influence, a presence, a world view. Therefore, he respectfully asked for time to deliberate. "Let me consult with my advisors. Give me a day, and tomorrow you'll have my answer." That night, the deliberation chamber was filled with silence and tension. Ahab stood, looking at his men, and expressed the complexity of the decision before him. "Sidon opens the gates of the sea to us. It offers us wealth, protection, and a future. But with Jezebel, something else comes. What will the prophets think? What will Elijah say?" Upon hearing that name, the counselors exchanged awkward glances. No one dared deny the power of the prophet's voice. However, it was one of those closest to Ahab who broke the silence. "Your Majesty, with respect, Elijah does not rule. You do. What is more valuable, the disapproval of a prophet or the prosperity of a nation? With this union, Israel will grow. Samaria will become a center of trade, a stable throne. The people need wheat, not warnings, peace, not fire." The others nodded, some out of conviction, others out of fear of being left behind in history. Ahab listened, reflected, and before dawn, his decision was made. The next day, he appeared before Ethbal with a resolute face and a firm voice. "I accept. I will make Jezebel my wife, and with you, King of Sidon, I will seal a covenant that no enemy will be able to break." Ethbal smiled faintly, as if he had expected that answer from the beginning. He ordered the scribes to seal the treaties with red wax, and the priests invoked the blessing of the gods. Then, with a solemn gesture, he ordered the hall doors to be opened, and then she entered. Jezebel. She walked forward with a firm step, dressed in deep blue linen embroidered with gold, her hair gathered in long braids that fell like living crowns. He didn't come as a pledge of an agreement. He came as an equal, as a figure who knew who he was. His eyes met Ahab's. In that instant, without a word, they both understood that the pact would not only be between kingdoms, but between destinies. Ethbal took his daughter's hand and placed it in Ahab's. "Here is Sidon," he said, "in blood, in wisdom, and in fire. Treat her as queen, and your kingdom will be unshaken." Jezebel didn't speak, but her silence was louder than many speeches. She looked around as if she were already measuring the terrain. She knew it wouldn't be long before she left her mark. That afternoon, when the engagement ceremony was over and the palace halls were darkened, Ahab asked Ethbal for a moment alone with Jezebel. They walked together through one of the interior courtyards, where marble fountains cascaded into pools surrounded by exotic flowers. The breeze carried the scent of the sea and the distant sound of seagulls. "Princess," Ahab said, breaking the silence, "ever since I arrived in Sidon, everyone has told me about you, about your wisdom, your influence, and your faith. But tell me, what do you expect from this pact?" Jezebel looked at him straight on with the same serenity with which she had entered the throne room. "I hope it's more than a pact, my lord. I hope it's a kingdom where we both rule, each from his own stronghold. You know the sword and the field. I know the altar and the word. Together we can make Israel a kingdom the nations won't forget." Ahab nodded, intrigued by the confidence with which she spoke. "In Israel we worship Jehovah, the God of our fathers. Aren't you afraid that your faith in Baal will be frowned upon?" Jezebel smiled faintly, a mixture of sweetness and defiance. "I don't fear what I don't know, and I know that where there is prosperity, the people open their hearts. Let me take my altars and my priests, and soon Samaria will be stronger and richer than you ever dreamed." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the murmur of water in the fountain. Ahab observed the gleam in Jezebel's eyes. It wasn't the gleam of a woman asking permission, but the gleam of someone who already felt part of what she was about to build. "Then," he said finally, "we will leave at dawn. Samaria will receive you as queen." "And I," she replied without looking away, "will receive Samaria as my own." At dawn, the caravan began its return to Israel. It wasn't just a wedding procession. It was a diplomatic, spiritual, and political procession. Jezebel did not travel alone. She was accompanied by priests, musicians, scribes, images of Astarte, incense, sacred scrolls, and a retinue formed to establish altars, not just homes. Ahab led her with dignity, knowing that what was entering Samaria wasn't just a queen, it was an era. During the journey, the villages they passed through stopped their work to watch the procession. The peasants, intrigued by this woman of regal bearing and strange clothing, murmured among themselves. Some bowed in respect. Others looked suspiciously at the Phoenician priests who walked behind her. The rumor of their arrival spread faster than the caravan itself, so that when the walls of Samaria appeared in the distance, the people were already gathered at the gates to witness their entry. The capital welcomed the king with the blare of trumpets and drums. Soldiers cleared the way while the crowd pressed in to get a close look at the foreign princess. Their jewels reflected the sunlight, and the scent of their perfumes mingled with the dust of the road. There was astonishment on their faces. Some smiled at the majesty of the scene, others frowned, wondering what the presence of a woman who did not belong to the people of Israel meant. When Ahab and Jezebel passed through the palace gates, the court was gathered to greet them. The throne room, lit by torches and bathed in light from the windows, was filled with murmurs. Then the king raised his hand and ordered silence. In a firm voice, he announced to the nobles, priests, and governors, "Today I present to you Jezebel, Princess of Sidon. From this day forward, she will be my wife and your queen. With her arrival, we seal an alliance that will bring prosperity and greatness to Israel." He had barely finished speaking these words when an uneasy murmur arose in the hall. Eyes turned toward the front door, where a man dressed in a rough camel's hair cloak and a leather belt entered unannounced. His steps were firm, and his eyes were like fire. Everyone recognized him. Elijah, a prophet of Jehovah. His voice resounded in the hall, cutting the air like a sword. "Is this what you will do, O King of Israel? Will you join your house with those who worship Baal and raise altars to other gods? You have been appointed to guide Israel in righteousness, not to give their hearts to idolatry. Do you forget that the Lord gave you this throne, and that He is the one who upholds your walls? No covenant can bring peace when the king's heart turns away from the living God. As the Lord lives before whom I stand, this covenant will bring weight and judgment upon your house." Ahab frowned and took a step toward him, containing his discomfort in front of the entire court. "Elijah, prophet, I seek peace and prosperity for my people. This alliance will open our doors to trade, strengthen our cities, and end the conflicts with the north. Does Jehovah take pleasure in poverty and isolation?" Elijah didn't lower his gaze. "The Lord delights in an upright heart. And I warn you, O king, what you think is gain now, you will soon see as loss. What now seems like strength will become a chain. You have opened the door, and through it will enter not only riches, but also foreign altars and hands stained with innocent blood. The silence was absolute. Jezebel, who until then had remained standing next to Ahab, turned her face and looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Who is this man who dares to speak to you like that on your own throne?" he asked in a low voice, but with a sharp look in his eyes. "It is Elijah," Ahab replied almost in a whisper, "a prophet of Jehovah, the God of Israel." Jezebel didn't take her eyes off him, but her lips curved into a slight smile that hid more than it showed. Then he said, "It will be interesting to see which of the two reigns in this land." Elias turned around and left without asking permission, leaving behind a heavy silence that neither the musicians nor the nobles dared to break. Ahab, regaining his composure, continued the presentation ceremony, but the prophet's words had already left a shadow in the air. The wedding took place a few days later in the royal courtyard, open to the sky and decorated with tapestries brought from Sidon and garlands of white and purple flowers. Israelite and Phoenician priests stood on either side, while the people watched from the outer plaza. Ahab wore a scarlet robe with gold trim, and Jezebel wore a fine linen dress embroidered with silver threads that shone like water in the sun. As the commitment was announced, trumpets blared and the people cheered, mixing emotion and uncertainty into a single clamor. The banquet lasted until late at night. There was music, dancing, and singing in 2 languages. Sidon and Samaria celebrated under the same stars, although each invoked a different god. The next day, Ahab ordered that a royal seat be built in the throne room next to his own. It would not be a secondary bench or a simple ceremonial seat, but a throne carved from cedar of Lebanon, inlaid with ivory, and adorned with figures of golden lions. He wanted Jezebel to sit next to him, not behind him, and for every visitor to understand that the queen shared authority with him. When the work was completed, Jezebel took her place beside the king with the ease of someone who had always belonged there. From then on, every hearing in Samaria was held under the watchful eye of 2 rulers. Ahab, heir to Omri, and Jezebel, daughter of Ethbal, whose influence was beginning to spread throughout Israel. Their union produced 3 children mentioned in the Bible, Ahaziah, Jehoram, and Athaliah. The latter, following the same spirit of ambition and power as her mother, would come to reign over Judah. Now Jezebel's first days in Samaria were ones of calculated observation. She didn't rush into sudden changes, but every step she took seemed to have a measured purpose. He presented himself generously to the people, distributing gifts brought from Sidon, fine fabrics, exotic spices, jewels, and perfumes that had never reached the markets of Israel. This carefully planned gesture won the affection of many, especially noble women, who soon began to imitate her style of dress and bearing. Thus, before he had even uttered a word about his gods, he had already won the admiration of a good part of the city. In private, her influence first reached the king's heart. In slow, subtle conversations, Jezebel began to speak to him about Baal, lord of rain and fertility, and Asherah, mother of life and protector of homes. He presented his cult as a sure source of abundance, a tangible path to guaranteed crops, livestock, and prosperity, and in those conversations, with a barely perceptible smile, he would make direct comparisons. "In Sidon, our prayers are not raised into thin air," he said softly. "Our gods are here among us. We can look into their faces, adorn them with gold and flowers, and they respond with rain and abundance. They don't hide. They don't remain invisible like the God you worship. A God who is not seen is a God who is silent. But Baal and Asherah, they listen and they respond. Convinced by his advice and seduced by the promise of prosperity, Ahab ordered an altar to Baal to be built in Samaria. The best craftsmen were summoned, and an imposing structure was erected in the central square. Carved stone columns, a bronze-clad altar, and an image of the god with arms extended toward the sky, demanding offerings from the people. In front of the altar, a large courtyard was set up for sacrifices and ritual dances, where music and incense smoke mingled with the clamor of the worshippers. But Jezebel didn't stop there. She also persuaded the king that Asherah should have a place of honor in Israel. Thus, in a sacred garden within the city, an image carved from cedar wood was erected, adorned with gold and precious stones. Phoenician priests brought from Sidon were appointed to officiate the rituals, and everything was arranged so that the worship of these gods would be integrated into the life of the kingdom. With the altars now up and running, Jezebel turned her attention to the court. At banquets, receptions, and private gatherings with the nobility, she recounted how Baal and Asherah had protected Sidon from drought, war, and famine. He described the rituals, festivals, and rewards these gods bestowed upon those who honored them, and in a persuasive tone, he repeated the same comparison he had used with Ahab. Israel serves a God who hides in the clouds, who does not show his face. But my gods are before you, visible, majestic, and close. They receive your offerings and return a blessing. The nobility, fascinated by the splendor of the temples and the majesty of the ceremonies, began to participate in the rites, wearing clothes with symbols of the Phoenician gods and offering their first offerings. Then it was the people's turn. Jezebel took advantage of festivities and gatherings in the plaza to speak directly to the crowd. With a firm voice and simple language, he promised that if Israel honored Baal and Asherah, the rains would come on time, the harvests would be abundant, and families would prosper. Baal brings rain to his children, and Asherah gives fruit to the womb and the earth, he declared with conviction. Honor them, and you will see prosperity in your fields and peace in your homes. Has your invisible God shown you his face? Have you seen his hand withholding the rain? Baal did, and Asherah too. The words, backed by the king's approval and the participation of the nobility, found immediate echo. What was initially curiosity turned into habit, and then into devotion. Entire families began offering flowers and oil on makeshift altars. Merchants placed small figures of Baal in their stalls, and children grew up hearing the names of these gods more than that of Jehovah. Over time, idolatry took on an even darker and more perverse face. The altars of Baal and Asherah were not only places of sacrifice, but also scenes of abominations. On nights of the full moon, the altar courtyards were filled with songs, music, and dances that culminated in ritual orgies, where men and women indulged in all kinds of lusts in the name of fertility. The priests and priestesses encouraged debauchery, proclaiming that carnal pleasure brought the blessing of the gods. But the most atrocious was reserved for the days of greatest festivity, human sacrifices. Amidst deafening drums and frenzied chanting, children were offered to Baal, placed in the glowing arms of his bronze statue. While smoke and the stench of burning flesh rose over the city, the screams were drowned out by the din of instruments and the clamor of the crowd, who believed they would thus ensure rain and prosperity. Thus, all of Israel, from the nobility to the last peasant, gave itself over to corruption, disguised as a cult. Orgies and sacrifices became part of the religious calendar, and the land that had been called to serve the living God was plunged under the shadow of foreign gods, covered in smoke, blood, and shame. It was then that a man's voice rose up in the midst of that darkness. The prophet Elijah, sent by Jehovah, traveled through villages, squares, and marketplaces, warning the people of the judgment that would come if they did not return to the God of their fathers. He spoke to them with the authority of one who does not seek his own glory, but eternal truth. "Return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," he cried. "He is the only living God. Your idols have eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear, hands but cannot handle. Turn away from the abomination before the earth is closed and the rain falls no more." But his words fell like seeds on hardened ground. Many responded with mockery, others turned away in indifference, and some threatened him for daring to speak out against Baal and Asherah. Jezebel, hearing rumors about the prophet, privately despised him, considering him a minor obstacle to her work. One day, Elijah decided to go to the heart of the problem, the palace. He passed through the gates of Samaria, climbed the steps, and stood before King Ahab, his eyes firm as rock fixed on the monarch's face. "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand," he said in a grave voice, "there shall not be dew nor rain these years except at my word. This is because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals." Silence fell over the room. Ahab, surprised, barely managed to respond with a gesture of disbelief. Jezebel, watching from an interior balcony, frowned in disdain, as if the prophet's words were nothing more than empty threats. But Elijah didn't wait for a reply. He turned around and left, leaving an invisible weight in the air that no one present could shake. Weeks passed, and the prophet's warning began to be fulfilled. The sky closed like an iron gate. There was no rain nor dew in the mornings. The rivers began to ebb, the fields cracked under the burning sun, and the cattle fell exhausted on the parched earth. Jezebel, restless but still defiant, ordered special rituals to be performed to Baal. The Phoenician priests danced day and night, poured out offerings of wine and oil, lit incense until the air was choked, and proclaimed that the rain god would soon answer. She herself, dressed in her ceremonial robes, ascended the altar, raising her hands toward the bronze statue. "O Baal, Lord of the clouds, send your rain upon this land," he cried in a loud voice. But the sky remained motionless, cloudless, as if mocking her plea. Months turned into years. 3.5 years without a drop of water. The cisterns were dry, the fields were covered with dust, and hunger was beginning to devour the homes. The murmur of the people turned into a bitter cry. "Baal doesn't answer. Jezebel has lied to us. Asherah doesn't listen." In the plazas and palace corridors, people began to remember Elijah's words. Some, secretly, began to murmur the name of Jehovah, like a whisper of hope that had not yet dared to become a cry. But Jezebel, furious at the growing distrust, hardened her heart even further, swearing that the prophet would pay for humiliating her. The earth, meanwhile, waited, and the sky remained closed. The hunger in Samaria was unbearable. The fields were dust, animals were dying for lack of water, and despair crept into every home. It was then that Elijah, moved by God's word, appeared before King Ahab. The king's face showed the tension of a ruler whose authority was crumbling along with his kingdom. "King of Israel," Elijah said firmly, Now summon all the people and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 Asherahs who eat at Jezebel's table. Let everyone come up with me to Mount Carmel, and there we will know who the true God is." Ahab, out of options and with the people demanding answers, sent messengers to every corner of the kingdom. Soon Mount Carmel was filled with crowds. Starving peasants, nobles dressed in worn robes, exhausted soldiers, and at the front, the priests of Baal and Asherah with their colorful robes and bronze crowns. Elijah stepped forward, his solitary figure contrasting with the crowd surrounding him. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Jehovah is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." The people remained silent. The prophets of Baal spoke, confident of their triumph. Elijah proposed the test: 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, but without human fire. The God who responded with fire, that would be the true God. The prophets of Baal began from morning until noon, dancing, shouting, and cutting themselves with knives, while crying out, "Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice, nor anyone to answer. Elijah, with a calmness that irritated his adversaries, said to them, "Shout louder, perhaps your God is meditating or has some work to do, or is on his way. Perhaps he's asleep and needs to be woken up." Hours passed, and the altar of Baal remained cold. Then Elijah repaired the altar of the Lord with 12 stones, 1 for each tribe of Israel, and placed the wood and the sacrifice on it. He ordered 4 jars to be filled with water and poured 3 times over the burnt offering, until the water ran around the altar and filled the trench. He raised his hands to heaven and prayed, "Jehovah, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Jehovah, answer me, so that this people may know that you, Jehovah, are the true God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you." Then fire came down from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even licked up the water in the trench. The people, terrified, fell on their faces, crying out, "Jehovah is God! Jehovah is God!" Elijah did not hesitate. "Arrest the prophets of Baal, let none of them escape." They brought them to the Kishon Valley, and there Elijah slaughtered them. Then he went up to the top of Carmel, bowed down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. He sent his servant 7 times to look toward the sea, and on the 7th occasion he said, "I see a small cloud like the palm of a man's hand rising from the sea." Elijah stood up and said, "Go and tell Ahab, yoke your chariot and go down so that the rain does not stop you." And in a few minutes, the sky darkened with clouds and wind, and a great rain fell upon the thirsty land. Ahab, soaked by the storm, hurried back to Samaria. The sound of his chariot wheels mingled with the crash of thunder, as if the heavens were trying to emphasize the moment. Upon arriving at the palace, he found Jezebel waiting for news. Her restless eyes searched the king's face for any sign of triumph. "Well?" he asked in a tone that mixed curiosity and authority. "Did Baal respond?" Ahab, in a tense voice, recounted everything that had happened. The humiliation of the prophets, the fire that came down from heaven on all the people, and how Elijah had slaughtered them on the banks of the Kishon River. Each word was like a blow that further fueled Jezebel's anger. Her lips curved into a cold smile, and her eyes turned like steel. "May the gods punish me mercilessly," he said in a firm and cutting voice, "if tomorrow at this time I do not do with Elijah's life what he did with the lives of my prophets." The message was sent without delay. When Elijah received it, he felt the weight of the threat. He didn't need anyone to command him. His heart sank, and he decided to flee, not out of cowardice, but because he knew Jezebel wouldn't rest until he saw him dead. Now days passed, and although the drought had ended, the spiritual tension in Israel did not diminish. Ahab's heart, dominated by Jezebel, grew increasingly insensitive to the voice of Jehovah. It was then that a new episode revealed the extent to which the queen's ambition and cruelty would go. In Jezreel, next to the king's palace, there was a beautiful vineyard carefully tended by a man named Naboth. His vines were heavy with grapes, and his land had been handed down from generation to generation. Ahab coveted it, wanting to turn it into a vegetable garden for his palace. One day, he approached Naboth and proposed, "Give me your vineyard to use as a garden, and I will give you a better one, or if you prefer, its price in money." But Naboth, faithful to the law of his fathers, answered, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." Ahab returned to the palace dejected, starved, and with a gloomy expression. Jezebel found him like this and, in a tone of disdain, said to him, "Are you now the king of Israel? Arise, eat, and be merry. I will give you Naboth's vineyard." Without waiting for a reply, Jezebel hatched a plan. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with the royal seal, and sent them to the elders and rulers of Naboth's city. In them he ordered a fast to be proclaimed, and Naboth to be placed in a place of honor, but 2 wicked men to be placed before him, who would accuse him of cursing God and the king. The sentence was implicit, death by stoning. So it was done. The people, deceived by the false accusation, took Naboth out of the city and stoned him to death. Upon receiving the news, Jezebel went to tell Ahab, "Get up and take possession of the vineyard that Naboth the Jezreelite refused to give you for money, for Naboth is no longer alive. He is dead." Ahab went down to take possession, believing the matter was closed. But Naboth's blood was crying out from the land, and God had already sent his prophet to confront the king. The sun fell obliquely on the rows of vines, bathing the leaves in gold and making the grapes shine like beads of blood. Ahab walked among the plants with silent satisfaction, stroking the branches as if they were newly won trophies. In the distance, a murmur distinct from the wind began to grow. Between the shadows of the olive trees, a figure moved forward with a firm step. It was Elijah, the prophet of Jehovah, the one whose word had closed the heavens and humbled the prophets of Baal on Carmel. Ahab's face hardened at the sight, but he didn't back down. Elijah stood before him, his eyes blazing with the certainty of one who speaks in the name of the Most High. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab spat with a mixture of contempt and fear. "I have found you," Elijah replied, "because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Do you think Naboth's blood does not cry out from this land? Thus says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked Naboth's blood, dogs will lick your blood, yes, yours." The silence weighed like lead. Elijah took another step, and his voice echoed like thunder over the hill. "Behold, I will bring evil upon you, and I will sweep away your descendants as one sweeps away dung, until there is not a man left in Israel of your lineage. And as for Jezebel, the dogs will devour her at the wall of Jezreel." Ahab swallowed, feeling each word sink into his flesh. His shoulders slumped, and his pride crumbled like an old wall. With a downcast face and a broken heart, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and fasted, walking slowly and humbly before God. Then the voice of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring disaster on him in his days. In the days of his son I will bring disaster on his house." The prophet withdrew with the certainty that, although judgment had been decreed, God's mercy still bowed to sincere repentance, but the shadow of the coming day still hung over Ahab's house. When Ahab returned to the palace, his face was marked by the weight of Elijah's words. He walked slowly through the corridors, as if each step brought him closer to an inevitable destiny. Entering the royal chamber, he found Jezebel sitting on her throne under a canopy of purple cloth adorned with jewels that glittered in the light of the lamps. "You're back," she said softly, though curiosity burned in her eyes. "What did that prophet tell you?" Ahab looked at her with a weariness he couldn't hide. "He didn't just talk about me. He talked about you. He said the dogs will devour you at the wall of Jezreel." For a moment, Jezebel watched him in silence, and then a cold, loud laugh filled the room. "Is that what he said?" he repeated with a wry smile. "The same one who closed the heavens and then fled like a coward when I threatened him. His words are nothing more than breath in the wind. I am the daughter of Ethbal, priest king of Sidon. My gods have always protected me, and they will continue to do so. Dogs?" She gave a shorter, sharper laugh. "There are only lions in my courtyards." He stood up with a firm step, his garment dragging on the stone floor, and approached Ahab with a gesture of contempt for divine warnings. "Do not let a man's words make you tremble. As long as I live, Baal and Asherah will have their altar in Samaria, and their worship will not be interrupted." But outside the palace walls, the wind seemed to carry an invisible whisper, announcing that Jehovah's words never fall to the ground unfulfilled. And although Jezebel laughed, the day that Elijah had prophesied had already begun to approach. Months passed, and war once again knocked on Israel's door. Syria, its longtime enemy, rose again. And Ahab, seeking glory for his name, decided to march to the battlefield with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Before leaving, the court prophets, men who only said what the king wanted to hear, assured him of victory. However, Micaiah, the prophet of Jehovah, spoke with a firm voice. The campaign would end in tragedy, and Ahab would not return alive. Even so, the king ignored the warning. He tried to cheat fate by disguising himself as a common soldier, thinking he would thus avoid the enemy's attack. Jehoshaphat dressed in his royal attire, while Ahab mingled with the ranks. But in the midst of the battle, a Syrian soldier, not knowing who he was aiming at, drew his bow and shot an arrow at random. The arrow flew through the chaos of battle and found a gap in Ahab's armor, plunging deep into his side. The king, mortally wounded, was held in his chariot as blood spilled onto the floor. He struggled to stay on his feet until the sun began to set, but finally his strength failed him. He died there, amid the clamor of the soldiers and the din of the lost war. His body was taken to Samaria, and the blood-stained chariot was left beside the pool where the harlots washed. As the servants began to clean the chariot, stray dogs came and licked the king's blood, just as Jehovah had spoken through Elijah. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The house of Ahab had received the first sign of its fall, and although full judgment had not yet arrived, the echo of divine judgment resonated in every corner of Samaria, reminding everyone that the word of the God of Israel is immutable. When the news of Ahab's death reached the palace, Jezebel, still dressed in her queen's robes, remained motionless for a few moments. Her hands, adorned with gold rings, trembled slightly, but her gaze remained firm, as if she refused to accept that the randomly fired arrow had defeated her husband. Then a murmur escaped his lips. He remembered, though he didn't want to admit it, the words Elijah had said to Ahab about his end. That phrase about dogs and blood crossed his mind like an icy shadow. In a gesture that puzzled some of the servants, Jezebel dropped a black veil over her face and locked herself in her chambers. Muffled wailing and soft knocking against the walls were heard. He wept, not with tears of regret, but with the rage of someone who feels his pride has been hurt. Her tears were not seeking Jehovah. They were seeking revenge against everything that represented the prophet who had announced that fate. After a few days, far from humbling herself before the God of Israel, Jezebel ordered a great sacrifice to Baal to be prepared. He ordered that the altars be adorned with flowers and fabrics brought from Sidon, that bonfires be lit, and that expensive perfumes be offered. He assured the court that Baal would give them strength to avenge the king's death and protect the throne. She even offered animals in abundance and, as if pain had made her more obstinate, she intensified her rites, repeating prayers and songs to her visible gods, the same ones that Elijah had unmasked on Mount Carmel. And so, instead of the people turning their eyes to Jehovah, the queen strengthened idolatry even more. The throne that had belonged to Ahab passed to his son, Ahaziah, a young man who was inexperienced and easily influenced, whom Jezebel, with sweet words and subtle manipulation, incited to continue the same evil practices that had brought judgment upon his father. Under his advice, Ahaziah not only kept the altars of Baal and Asherah standing, but also renewed the pagan sacrifices and festivals, thus prolonging the corruption that had covered Israel. Eventually, an unexpected event marked the young king's course. As he walked through the upper room of his palace in Samaria, a window lattice gave way and fell heavily to the floor. The fall left him severely injured and bedridden. Rather than seeking the God of Israel, he sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, wanting to know if he would recover. But the Lord, seeing the stubbornness of their hearts, sent Elijah to intercept them, and the prophet, with a firm and unhesitating voice, declared, "You will not get up from the bed to which you have gone up, but you will surely die." The divine decree was carried out exactly. A few days later, the young king breathed his last, and the news of his death spread throughout Samaria like a sharp blow that froze the air. Jezebel, dressed in mourning, wept loudly, not out of regret, but out of frustration at seeing the lineage she had sought to consolidate broken. Even through tears, her heart remained hardened, clinging to the gods who had not saved her son. After Ahaziah's death, the throne remained vacant. His brother Jehoram, another son of Jezebel, came to power. And like a cycle that repeated itself tirelessly, the queen made sure that he too walked the same crooked path as his predecessors. He instilled in him the same worship of Baal, the same contempt for Jehovah's commandments, and the same pride that had sealed the fate of his house. Thus idolatry remained alive, corruption deepened, and the shadow of Jehovah's judgment continued to extend, invisibly but inevitably, over the house of Ahab and over all Israel. During his reign, tensions with Syria intensified, and armed conflict became almost constant. It was during one of these military campaigns at Ramoth-Gilead that Joram was seriously wounded by enemy arrows. Retreating from the front, he sought refuge and recovery in Jezreel, unaware that there the judgment that Elijah had prophesied against his house was about to be fulfilled. Jehu, commander of the army, had been secretly anointed by a messenger of the prophet Elisha with a clear mission to destroy the house of Ahab. With the ardor of divine command in his heart, Jehu marched resolutely toward Jezreel. When Joram, still weak and convalescing, rode out in his chariot to meet him, he asked, "Is there peace, Jehu?" The answer was a blade that cut through the air. "What peace, while the fornication of your mother Jezebel and her many sorceries continue?" At that instant, Joram understood that this was not a diplomatic meeting, but his sentence. He turned his chariot to flee, but Jehu drew his bow tightly, and with a single, well-aimed shot, the arrow pierced his back and exited through his heart. The king collapsed in the chariot, his blood splashing onto the planks of the vehicle. Jehu ordered his captain to throw the body into the field of Naboth of Jezreel, remembering the words of Jehovah given to Elijah years before, that in that same place the blood of Ahab and his descendants would be shed. Thus the Lord's words were fulfilled to the letter. Joram died without leaving a legacy of justice or an honorable memory, but as another link in the chain of corruption his father had started. Meanwhile, Jezebel, upon receiving the news, did not break down or weep with repentance. Her weeping was one of fury and wounded pride, for she saw her power crumbling. But still, deep down in his heart, he believed he could defy God's word and stand. In Jezreel, Jezebel still clung to the throne as if power could stay the hand of judgment. When he received the news that Jehu was coming to the city, he understood that it would not be a simple visit. However, instead of trembling, she prepared herself like a queen who intends to face death with haughtiness. She painted her eyes with kohl, arranged her hair, and placed on the most imposing crown she still had. She climbed to the palace window, watching from above as the dust of the road announced the arrival of the new king. Jehu entered the city gate with the same force with which he had struck down Joram. The horses' hooves sounded on the stone, and the spears of his men flashed in the sun. Seeing this, Jezebel spoke in a loud voice, full of mockery and venom. "Do you fare well, Zimri, murderer of his master?" His words were a challenge, an attempt to provoke and show that he did not yet recognize the weight of divine judgment. Jehu, without responding to their mockery, looked up at the window and cried, "Who is with me? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs who had served silently under his tyranny for years cautiously peered out. At that moment, Jehu gave the sharp, curt command, "Throw her down." In a single movement, the hands that had previously obeyed Jezebel grabbed her and threw her into the void. The queen's body hit the wall, and then the ground with a loud crash. Blood splattered the wall and the horses' hooves. Jehu drove his chariot over it without stopping, as if it were a worthless obstacle. Afterward, Jehu went in to eat and drink, but later remembered that she was a king's daughter and ordered her to be buried. However, when they went to look for his body, they found that almost nothing remained, only his skull, his feet, and the palms of his hands. The dogs of Jezreel had devoured his flesh, exactly fulfilling the word that Jehovah had spoken through Elijah. In the field of Jezreel, the dogs will eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the body of Jezebel will be like dung on the open field, so that they will not say, "This is Jezebel." With his death, the earth rested from its violence, and heaven justly sealed the last chapter of its history. However, the sentence did not end there. Jehu, zealous for the word of the Lord, exterminated the entire house of Ahab, leaving no male descendants, and destroyed all his relatives and allies. All this occurred as a direct consequence of the sins and corrupting influence of Jezebel, whose hands had led kings and peoples into idolatry and rebellion against the living God. His name remained as an eternal warning that no pride, no matter how adorned with power and cunning, can prevail against the word of Jehovah.